So what's the difference between AC and SIMV? The main difference is seen when the patient triggers a breath. So let's figure out how we can tell when a patient tries to trigger a breath. To identify a patient's attempt to trigger a breath, we will look at this graphic. So let's observe a few things. When the patient triggers a breath, you will notice a slight dip at the very beginning. The ventilator will not know the patient is attempting to breathe until the patient reaches the preset trigger. And the term trigger just simply refers to the point in which you want the ventilator to respond to a patient's effort to inhale. The respiratory therapist is the one that determines this. And once the trigger has been reached, the ventilator will deliver a breath. So let's look at the difference between a breath that is delivered in the AC mode versus the SIMV mode. In volume AC, the AC stands for assist control. And in this mode, when the patient reaches the trigger, the ventilator will assist the patient's effort by giving the set controlled tidal volume. In other words, it assists the patient by controlling the amount of volume the patient receives. What are some pros and cons to this? On one hand, if a patient is weak, but they need a regular amount of volume, the patient only needs to reach the trigger and the machine will take over and give a controlled full volume breath. This mode is good because it ensures the patient always receives a full volume. But there are some drawbacks too. For example, what if the patient wants a smaller volume? Well, in AC mode, the patient cannot change the amounts of volume they receive. And this can lead to hyperventilation and can be really uncomfortable, especially when the patient doesn't want the exact fixed controlled volume. So what should you do? You can switch to the SIMV mode. Just like in the AC mode, if a patient does not trigger a breath, the patient will receive the set controlled volume. However, with SIMV, when a spontaneous breath is initiated, the patient determines the volume. So that means if the patient wants a lower volume during their spontaneous efforts, they will receive a lower volume. In AC, spontaneous triggers result in the set controlled volume. But in SIMV, spontaneous triggers result in whatever volume the patient wants. This gives the respiratory therapist a pretty good idea if the patient can be weaned off the ventilator. If the patient had enough strength to take bigger spontaneous volumes, the weaning might be successful. Well, what if the patient on SIMV can't take a large enough spontaneous breath? Do you need to switch them back? Not necessarily. You can always add pressure support to the spontaneous breaths. And what is pressure support? Let me explain. If you've ever lifted weights, understanding pressure support is easier than you think. If you're spotting someone who is struggling to lift, what you're really doing is you're supporting them. If they need a little help, you provide a little support. But if you have to give too much support, your friend probably should not be lifting the heavy weights. Well, the same principle is true with SIMV. If the patient needs more volume during a spontaneous effort, add pressure support. How much should you give? Generally, a good amount is about 10 to 15 initially, but you can adjust this up or down. Just be careful. If you start giving too much support, like over 20, the patient may not be ready to take spontaneous breaths. So you may consider switching back to the AC mode. So there you have it, AC and SIMV. There are other differences too, but this should be enough to help you get started.